It is essential to commence our journey into the world of William Shakespeare in Stratford-upon-Avon. It was here that he was born, spent his childhood, fell in love, and raised his children. Stratford was the place to which he returned time and time again. During his career, he bought land here and the impressive house New Place after gaining literary and financial success in London. This building, Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-upon-Avon, is the perfect place to start delving into the life of William Shakespeare. He was baptized here on April the 26th, 1564, and he was buried here. We don't know for certain, but it is possible that Shakespeare's birthday was on the very same day as the day he died, April the 23rd, St. George's Day. This Holy Trinity Church goes back to the early 13th century and is the oldest building in Stratford-upon-Avon. But great changes that happened within these walls in the few years before Shakespeare's name was entered into the baptismal register here. The church had lost its connection with Rome. This was the England of Elizabeth, the England of the Reformation, initiated by Henry VIII. Like many other families, the Shakespeares were deeply affected by this enforced change in their religious practice. Nothing was certain. Many shifts and changes in the years after Henry VIII. First to Protestant Edward VI, then back to Catholicism with Mary, and then Elizabeth, who was determined to rule in the Protestant way.
Stratford, at the time of Shakespeare's birth, it was a town of about 2,000 people. It was a market town. It served the neighborhood. People would come from neighboring villages to bring their produce.
Stratford is a town that was predominantly agricultural, and it's very ideally situated for the Cotswolds. So the wool trade was very, very prominent in Stratford.
Stratford-on-Avon in the mid-16th century was an unremarkable little town, a small population of around 2,000, and it was a struggle for the town to maintain such a number. Outbreaks of the plague were common here as they were across the country. The Black Death had come to England 200 years before, and everyone lived in daily fear of the return of this deadly disease.
The plague was always a concern in Stratford, as it was in other towns as well. Almost every year the plague would have hit Stratford. The year Shakespeare was born happened to be a particularly bad year for the plague.
There's one very good example in the parish register in front of me here that is from July of 1564, just 3 months or so after Shakespeare himself is born. The clerk who's recording the burials for Stratford has taken special care to note in Latin, hic incipit pestis, so here begins the plague. And you can see that from the list of burials that follows, a huge number of people are dying in a very short period of time. Almost 200 people, or about a seventh of the population of Stratford. So if you think that Shakespeare would have been just a few months old, what infant mortality would have been like at the time, he's sort of very lucky to have survived that whole incident.
We know that on houses on either side of the house where they were living, children born in the same year as Shakespeare had died from the plague. So he survived.
It was in this house in Henry Street that we believe William Shakespeare was born. He was the son of John Shakespeare and Mary Arden. Now the Ardens were a very well-established family here in Warwickshire. They trace their roots back to before William the Conqueror. And when William Shakespeare arrived, his parents must have seen that as a very great blessing indeed, because they'd already lost 2 baby girls.
John Shakespeare, William Shakespeare's father, started very humbly in Stratford, started as an apprentice glove maker. He became an ale taster. He became somebody who checked that bread was made properly, and then worked his way up to eventually becoming the mayor of Stratford. When young William was 4, this is when his father's made the mayor. And he would have had, on the day he went to any council meetings, he would have had almost like a procession from the front of the house down Henry Street and along to the town hall. So that must have made a huge impression on a very young William Shakespeare, seeing his father dressed in all his regalia, parading down Henry Street. He was always known as a glove maker stroke widower. Now, a widower is a tanner but who's producing really fine white leather. And that ties in with the sort of gloves that John Shakespeare was making. These are fashionable, high quality gloves made for the well-to-do.
As a young boy, William would have been in contact with all kinds of people through the trade connections of his father. This could have given him inspiration and language for the colourful characters in his plays. John Shakespeare had a mysterious side, which we can only guess at. It is very possible that he was a secret Roman Catholic. Now, was this the reason that he didn't attend church? That he received a fine from the Queen? And that he had his name on a list nailed to the church door? Or was it because he'd been exposed dealing illegally in wool, so that he was nervous of stepping out and being arrested? See, this was the atmosphere of the time. If you stretched the law even a little bit, you were reported.
I think there was this sense of turmoil of not being certain how long Elizabeth's reign was perhaps going to last, and with the changes that happened in previous reigns with Mary and Edward and Henry before them, there was that element of uncertainty and the state wanting to control things much more closely. So John Shakespeare's name appears on a recusancy list, which is people who have failed to take the Protestant communion.
We now know, of course, Queen Elizabeth has a network of spies throughout England. If you're a wool merchant, you pay taxes to the Crown on your transactions. So, of course, John Shakespeare isn't doing this. So, did the Wool Merchants Guild get tipped off by one of Queen Elizabeth's spies? Hey, there's this guy in Stratford, John Shakespeare, buying all this wool. He's not in the guild, he's not paying taxes. What are you going to do about it? But of course, what they did, John Shakespeare was fined. The wool he bought, which he hadn't actually sold on, it was all confiscated. And from that moment on, John Shakespeare is heavily in debt.
John Shakespeare lost much of his wealth and his property because of the fines imposed upon him. But he didn't lose this house in Henry Street. Later on, things got better. Because John was still held in good opinion by the aldermen of Stratford, he was granted his own coat of arms in 1592 and was therefore back in business for the rest of his life.
The town in Shakespeare's boyhood had an important school, King Edward's School, a foundation of King Edward VI.
It would have been a normal education, so perhaps it would be challenging by our standards, and it was often said that the Latin and Greek that Shakespeare would have learned, or any grammar school pupil would have learned, would be the equivalent to a university classics course. Today, school starts at 6 o'clock in the morning and they go through the whole day. They would have started learning simple alphabet and the catechism, sort of the Lord's Prayer, things like that, and then moved on to more complex things. Start with perhaps Aesop's fables, you'd learn your grammar as well, perhaps some Seneca, Virgil. So all of the sort of the classic authors that we think of would have been very much the foundation of that curriculum.
He would have read Ovid's Metamorphoses, for example, the great Latin classic. He would have read Virgil's Aeneid. It was an education in oratory and rhetoric, and that is reflected in his plays, I think. He would have learnt there to argue. He would have learnt there to argue on both sides of the case, and he's brilliant at doing that in the plays. If you take a play like Measure for Measure, for example, where Claudio, the young Claudio, is condemned to death, there's a wonderful scene where the Duke is disguised as a friar, is trying to persuade Claudio to be absolute for death, as he says, and he's trying to persuade him of the consolations of religion, that it's not all that bad to die after all. But then a few hundred lines later, there's a wonderful speech from Claudio, which puts exactly the opposite point of view. Aye, but to die and go we know not where, to lie in cold obstruction and to rot. Now there's an example of Shakespeare's dialectic skill, the way that he can present two totally opposing cases within a single scene of a play.
Now, of course, Stratford is synonymous with the name Shakespeare, and you can see memorials to his legacy all over this town. But of course, William had no chance of establishing himself as an actor or a playwright here. Although his father had a very prosperous career in William's early years, later he had huge financial problems, and it was only by a very risky move to London that William was able once again to restore the name of Shakespeare. This is the cottage of the Hathaway family. We know that William Shakespeare married Anne Hathaway in 1582, when William was 18, and she was some 8 or 9 years older. But it is remarkable how little else we know about her, and we can only speculate about their marriage. We do know they had 3 children. There was Susanna, the firstborn, and then the twins, Hamnet and Judith. Hamnet was to die when he was 11 years old from an outbreak of the plague. But for a man who wrote wonderful love sonnets and who penned the greatest love story ever, Romeo and Juliet, it is remarkable how little we know about his own love story.
It is my lady. Oh, it is my love. Oh, that she knew she were. She speaks, yet she says nothing. What of that? Her eye discourses. I will answer it. I am too bold. 'Tis not to me she speaks.
We do know that in August 1582, Stratford enjoyed the benefits of a bounteous harvest. And it must have been at this time that William and Anne had their lovers' tryst. Perhaps on a summer's evening, sitting on a set hay bale during the feasting to celebrate the end of harvest, William, still a teenager, his quick and easy wit charms Anne. Maybe they had a hand-fasting ceremony. It's an ancient tradition still existing in Warwickshire at the time, in which the couples shared vows and then shared a bed before the official church wedding.
Oh, me. She speaks. Oh, speak again, bright angel.
Oh, Romeo, Romeo. Wherefore art thou, Romeo?
The legal age to marry is 21. So if you imagine you're a young man, you've served your apprenticeship, you're in your early 20s, you then have to get yourself a job. And so the logical thing is you're not marrying, and you're not marrying girls from villages until your mid-20s. So here we have young William Shakespeare, who's only 18, and he's underage. I'm sure she would have had young farmers queuing up to marry her. So what's this young William Shakespeare got going for him at this point in time?
Romeo doff thy name, and for that name which is no part of thee, take all myself.
I take thee at thy word. Call me but love, and I'll be new baptized.
Whatever the details were, we know for certain that Anne became pregnant, and an official church ceremony had to be rushed through before a noticeable bump developed. There was a hurried dash to Bishop's Court in Worcester to enable the marriage to proceed, and the huge sum of £40 was paid as surety for a marriage bond to be paid if the marriage were to prove invalid. We know that William Shakespeare married Anne Hathaway in 1582 when they had their first child, Susanna, in the year after. But the years 1585 to 1592 are a time of intense frustration for Shakespeare historians. We know practically nothing at all about that elusive 7-year period, and consequently we have no idea how and why he first began his career upon the stage. Many theories have been advanced. Some say that he headed off for Lancashire, the Catholic stronghold. An earlier biographer said that he became a schoolteacher in the country.
I think it's perfectly possible that he was kept on at Stratford School as an usher, they were called, the assistant schoolmaster. He was obviously a very talented, clever boy. I think it's quite possible that he did some teaching here.
Or perhaps he joined a travelling group of players, many of which came through Stratford to perform, and this is where he found his calling. We know that in 1587, the Queen's men came to Stratford. These were a group of travelling players backed by Queen Elizabeth I's government who performed around the country what was essentially propaganda to support her reign. The Queen's men weren't a touring company in the modern sense of the word, no, they were more of a variety act. Acrobatic performances and comic routines alongside the plays, but it is the list of those plays and the fact that they were here in Stratford which is the interesting point. We know from old records that they put on the story of Richard III, the story of King Lear, the famous victories of Henry V, and don't they sound familiar? Is it possible that Shakespeare did join that company and was inspired to write his own version of the stories of the plays that they were producing?
Omit no happy hour that may give furtherance to our expedition, for we have now no thought in us but France, save those with God that run before our business. Therefore let every man now task his thought, that this fair action may on foot be brought.
We know that 2 of the Queen's men went and performed in Elsinore, famously the setting for Hamlet.
I have heard that guilty creatures sitting at a play have by the very cunning of the scene been struck so to the soul that presently they have proclaimed their malefactions. For murder, though it have no tongue, shall speak with most miraculous organ.
Another of the Queen's men, William Nell, was killed in a brawl outside a tavern near Oxford, just before the company came to Stratford.
There was a fight and one of the actors was actually stabbed to death. And there is a belief that possibly William Shakespeare stepped in to that role and then carried on and eventually got to London that way.
It is possible. But unless some late 16th century document turns up in some old drawer, we sadly will have no hard evidence to support this or any other theory.
At some point he makes that decision to move to London. We know in Henley Street there was a stable owned by the Greenaways, and he would have hired his horse or had his horse stabled there and then made that journey to London.
Whether Shakespeare arrived in London as part of a troupe or followed them on his own, this was a momentous undertaking for him. It would mark the dawn of an unparalleled talent, as the author of a body of work that would be unsurpassed and would influence generations to come. The London that Shakespeare found was a dynamic mix of people involved in various trades: shipping, makers and bakers, lawyers and priests, and a court at Whitehall with Queen Elizabeth at its head.
London was about 100 times bigger than Stratford. It was a town of about 200,000 people, a city, of course. It was a walled city with numerous churches, over 300 churches, a cosmopolitan place, of course, being on the Thames. It was a place where travellers would come and go, bringing their goods from abroad. It was a bustling, thriving, busy, in some ways rather sordid place. It was just beginning to have a theatrical community. That begins during Shakespeare's lifetime.